It's become impossible to ignore in the last 10 years that both the left and the right make a lot of claims to virtue, and each side throws the complaint at the other that what they're practicing or preaching is a kind of phony virtue. So, there's this whole discourse for I think about 10 years now about so-called virtue signaling. What I don't see are analyses or reflections on how the left and the right, respectively, really think about virtue, in earnest, when they're not just complaining or mocking the other side. What is virtue to them and what is virtue to us? So the remarks I have in this video, I think, are very true of the northern United States and Canada. I think they would be less true of the southern United States, and then less true of Mexico, and less true of France and Germany, but by degrees. I think what I'm saying here is true to some extent of many Western democracies. I would not assume that what I'm saying in this video would be true in Sweden or Japan. This is a little bit of a Canadian-centric video, and it's definitely going to be true in Detroit, New York City, and so on, those northern states. The most striking thing about the right-wing concept of virtue right now in 2019 is that it's based on a notion of sufficient virtue. All right, I'll clarify what I mean. There's a point at which you have enough virtue for them, their perspective of the world. You've satisfied the requirement, and then you're accepted as a member of their team. And it's not that you can do no wrong, but your various sins and shortcomings are basically kind of overlooked, right? So the left complains about this, and they can't comprehend it. And, look, how would you feel, you personally, whoever you are watching this video, if your employer at work had the type of sex life that Donald Trump has? All right? I wouldn't be comfortable with that. Now, a new book has just been published detailing a whole lot of more allegations against Donald Trump. But one feature of his sex life that's been attested to and brought to court by various women is just his involvement in prostitution. So there are allegations of criminal activity of various kinds. But even setting that aside, if you even just look at the various forms of prostitution and womanizing this guy has engaged in his whole life, including when he's married to other women and stuff, how would you feel? And I'm talking about feeling here. I'm not talking about some kind of, detached intellectual exercise. If you went to work every day and your boss was a multimillionaire who had a sex life like Donald Trump, I would be looking to quit my job. I'd be looking to get employment elsewhere just for that reason. Just being honest with you. I would not be comfortable working for someone who had a sex life like Donald Trump. It's true. It's not any of my business. You know what I mean? If I had an employer who was a millionaire who was living that kind of life, I would not be looking for my opportunity to report him to the police or something. Like, as an employee, I wouldn't have that kind of knowledge. I'd be aware, whoa, this is how this guy plays the game. I don't want to be associated with that. I don't want to be near that. I don't want to take orders from that guy. I don't want to find myself in a situation where I'm covering up for him or making excuses for him, where I'm being ordered to do things. I've got to get out of this company. I've got to get out of this business, whatever it is, right? That's how I would feel in that situation. Here's the puzzling thing. Does that make me left-wing or does that make me conservative, right? Like, traditionally, you would think conservatism is associated with demanding that people live up to a Christian, frankly, in this cultural context, but a Christian standard of sexual decency. And then that if people don't live up to that standard, they'll be punished. But on the contrary, the pattern we have right now is, on the left, there's virtue, but there's no criterion for sufficient virtue. There's never a point you get to where it's enough. So everyone comments on this, including stand-up comedians, but it also comes up in formal, political science context. All right. Years ago, I got a complaint sent to my channel. So I was having this conversation relayed through another YouTuber. Somebody complained that they don't watch my channel because I don't have enough videos about black slavery. I did not just shut this person down and dismiss them or something. I actually engaged in the conversation. I said, well, what do you mean? So this is years ago, but at that time I said, I have like 2 videos up talking about the history of slavery in Haiti in the Caribbean. Right? I was like, well, I actually did some research on this. So I have 2 different videos talking about Haiti and the Caribbean and slavery there, and I sent those links. And let's say I had like one other video at the time that was talking about slavery in relation to African Americans. Like I didn't have a million. So no, I actually have a couple of videos talking about that. But I stepped back, I said, look, why are you demanding this of me? Like that's not my area of expertise. And, what came back was an accusation that I was racist. My YouTube channel, because I only had 3 videos at that time talking about the topic. Now I have more. But, that because this wasn't my top priority, there was racist. And I really tried to stay on the page with this person for long enough to ask. I was just trying to figure this out. This is a 21st century stereotypical left-wing perspective that no matter how much you do, it's never enough. So, well, wait a minute. Do you know this stuff about me? I did humanitarian work in Cambodia and Laos. So I have videos talking about racism in that part of the world. I have videos talking about slavery in Thailand. Did you know Thailand has a history of slavery? That's something I've done research on. That's something I have expertise in. So, if you're presuming that I'm racist, because that's not my top priority, why can't you look at the things that are my priority and then judge my politics or judge my racism accordingly? So that conversation went on for a little while with weighing my soul about whether or not I'm committed enough to that issue. Now, of course, the other thing that came up was, well, look, I have a lot of videos talking about racism in relation to Native people, the Indigenous people in Canada, the Cree, the Ojibwe. That's something else I studied and care about, And I've got to tell you something. Everyone says this about the left in 2019. Everyone jokes about this. It's never enough. There is no way you can ever care enough about racism. There's no way you can ever care enough about slavery. There's no way you can ever be left-wing enough for the left-wingers. Never. Nothing will satisfy them. And the contrast is, coming out of the Christian culture of forgiveness, coming out of the Christian culture of unconditional love and acceptance, coming out of the Christian culture of hating the sin but not the sinner. For the conservatives, their idea of virtue, you can have sufficient virtue. You can be good enough. So, Rush Limbaugh, he's a right-wing commentator, he can be a drug addict and go to rehab, but they can still love him and support him. Jordan Peterson becomes a drug addict and goes to rehab. They still love him and support him. Donald Trump gets caught paying women for sex, being connected to prostitution in various ways by various witnesses. They still love him and they support him. Once someone has enough virtue, they accept that person and say, okay, you're on our team. You're working towards our goals. We're all working to the same objective. So even though you have sins and shortcomings, we're going to still love the sinner and hate the sin. There's enough virtue for us to accept you and have you on our team. So there's a kind of strength to that. There's a kind of ecumenicalism to that, right? Like they're willing to bridge the gap between multiple churches. That's what I'm saying. Ecumenicalism, even though paradoxically that comes out of a more narrow-minded, judgmental Christian tradition. The supposedly broad, open, secular, rational left-wing tradition seems to leave people without the kind of road signs that lets you know this is the minimum speed, this is the maximum speed, and as long as you're within that range, you're virtuous enough to play in our team to work with us, right? It's like these guys on the left are playing where no matter how fast you drive your car, it's never fast enough, right? No matter how committed you are to one virtuous cause or another, you can never be virtuous enough. And there's this perpetual game of each person snubbing the other for who's more left-wing, who's more woke, what have you. And it's unbelievably self-defeating, right? That's my observation about virtue and the kind of peculiar advantage that the right has, despite this horrible, Christian political legacy they're working from in their playbook. All right. switch around. The advantage the left has, and this is a profound, deep advantage that people on the right aren't even aware of, is that the left presumes government exists to help those in need. Government exists to provide social services to the poor. Now that may sound obvious to you. No, it's not. The conservatives who are alive today, conservatives under 50 years old, like it's different if you're talking about people 80 years old. You know, I admit there's some elderly conservatives that would apply to. But conservatives under 50 years old who've really been living in the neoconservative, neoliberal, world, the decades that have led up to the present one, okay, they see the function of government as being by and for the rich. They actually see the government as serving the captains of industry, as sitting down and negotiating with the oil companies. Like, how can taxpayers' dollars be used to help the oil companies get richer? And they're not even aware of that bias. Like, it's kind of unbelievable and mind-blowing that they see it as virtuous for the government to destroy publicly provided health insurance in order to make more money and more profits by the private for-profit insurance industry. That's a very interesting part of George W. Bush's presidency that ended in failure. It failed and failed repeatedly. He tried to privatize more of healthcare, more of health insurance. And, the theory was that it would be more efficient and have all these positive effects, and that didn't happen, and he took a series of steps, and then eventually they had to give up on it. No, it doesn't work, okay? That they actually think of it as virtuous and positive for government, including Donald Trump himself, to sit down with industry and have a meeting and say, how can we cut back environmental protection so that you can make more money? That they see it as virtuous for government to sit down with the captains of industry and help the rich get richer, and not just through tax cuts, not just through corporate welfare, not just through bailout packages, but through taking taxpayers' money and spending it to help corporations become more profitable, more competitive, and so on. And of course, what's sick about that is that they've reinvented socialism under the aegis of crony capitalism. It's a socialism kind of diverted from its purpose that was very clear to everyone back during the Great Depression, or before that even, in what's called the progressive era of politics in the United States of America, where the same justification that exists for government intervention in the free market to help the poor escape extreme poverty is now being used to justify the rich getting richer. And again, it's worth just mentioning, they see no shame in the trappings of power being used that way. Because very often you even see the meetings. Example, George W. Bush inviting in the head of Enron Corporation. Some of you won't remember. It was a notorious, corrupt corporation that broke the laws in many ways. George W. Bush giving the head of Enron a special desk inside the White House. George W. Bush actively courting the support of, and him supporting, the Enron company and the particular executive who's at the top of that company, right? So this is like the libertarian and conservative tradition being perverted to the point where it starts to resemble socialist syndicalism, but it's a socialist syndicalism that's by and for the rich, where they've lost. So again, that notion of virtue on the left, the notion of virtue on the left, that government exists for the poor, it exists to help those in need, period. Ironically, that much more closely resembles a Christian tradition of humble service to the needy, of soup kitchens, and so on and so forth, right? Whereas the right wing, the current right wing notion of virtue is antithetical to that. People don't change unless or until they want to change. And I feel I'm living in a period of time when there have been remarkably few new ideas in the last 100 years. I really do feel, I know we're sitting here, this is the internet, we have all these, technologies that surround us. Okay, real quick example, philosophy of education. Since Montessori, in the last 100 years, have there been any new ideas in philosophy of education? There was the Montessori system, there were the libertarians calling for vouchers and free market reforms. There have been incredibly few new ideas in education. There have been incredibly few new ideas in politics from my biased perspective, okay? Individual people change when they want to change and no sooner, all right? Culture. When does a culture change? All right? I think a culture only changes when it has to change. And I'm really sitting here waiting and eager for the ideas that are going to challenge and overturn the neoliberal paradigm. More than 10 years we've been talking about this. Neoliberalism just fell apart, really even before 2008. Neoliberalism's over. The days of neoliberalism are over. Its economic and political paradigm has fallen apart. All right? And there has been an unbelievable ideological silence. And even someone like Bernie Sanders really represents a hodgepodge of ideas from at least 25 years ago, if not 50 years ago. There are not a lot of new ideas in that package. Bernie Sanders is mostly running on the promise that the United States can catch up with Canada, or the United States can catch up with Scotland in providing basic services like healthcare to the poor. All right? I've got to tell you something, guys. I'm waiting for that change. I'm waiting for those new ideas to come. And maybe what's holding us back, despite these new technologies of the internet, is precisely that we're locked in the unchallenged and unchanged assumptions of what is virtue. And so much of political discourse has just become an expression of why it is we think we're virtuous, why it is I think I'm better than you, you think you're better than me. Politics ceases to become an exchange of ideas in the pursuit of a positive outcome, a goal, a reform, an improvement, and it becomes instead just an exchange of egos.